Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Bean Family Stories channel. This is where we bring you interesting, funny and inspiring stories from Mr. Bean family every day. You will meet me, Mr. Bean's daughter, someone you may be familiar with and I hope you love, my dad with his surprising and meaningful stories, and my lovely brother who always brings positive energy with his stories close to life. Every day, one of us will share new stories, interesting journeys, and today it's my turn. I will take you on an exciting adventure, but also with profound lessons about life. Today's story carries a simple but important message: never judge something by its appearance. Behind that appearance, there are always surprises waiting for us. If you like our family dynamic, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our stories on this amazing journey. Share this video with your friends, family, and loved ones, and don't forget to leave some interesting comments to let me know what you think. Now, let's dive into today's story and dive into the world of surprises. Let's get started. Megan Warren stepped through the grand glass doors of the Sterling Room, her weary body resisting the cool draft of the restaurant's luxurious interior. She had just flown in from Singapore, a grueling 20-hour journey, and had come straight to this upscale dining establishment in Manhattan without even stopping at her hotel. Her black dress, chosen more for comfort than style, hung loosely on her slender frame. The wrinkles in her clothes, a testimony to the cramped economy seat and stale airplane air, were visible to anyone paying attention. Her chestnut hair, which usually had a polished look, had long since escaped its hastily tied ponytail, now framing her tired face in unruly strands. She hadn't slept in over 36 hours, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story of back-to-back meetings across time zones, the disorienting effects of jet lag, and the exhausting expectations of international diplomacy. Megan was used to the pressure, the long flights, the endless hours of work, but today, it felt heavier. She pulled her small carry-on bag close to her, tucking it discreetly by the host stand as she approached. The host, a young man with a tight smile, studied her for a moment. She could feel the skepticism radiating from him as he glanced at her rumpled appearance. "May I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of judgment. "I believe Antonio is expecting me," Megan said quietly, her voice calm, despite the fatigue that lingered in her every word. The host hesitated, his gaze flickering toward her modest outfit and unkempt hair before nodding and leading her toward the center of the room. She could feel eyes on her as she walked. The Sterling Room was Manhattan's temple of exclusivity, where reputations were made and broken, where the powerful and the influential congregated in their finely tailored suits and glittering jewelry. Megan, in her worn black dress and understated presence, felt like an anomaly among the sea of well-heeled patrons. The hushed whispers of disapproval were just under the surface, but she paid them no mind. As she reached the table in the center of the room, Megan caught sight of Richard Harrison, a hedge fund manager with a reputation that preceded him in Manhattan's upper circles. His Seville Row suit fit perfectly, like armor, while his Swiss watch gleamed in the soft lighting. He was flanked by his equally immaculate companions, all of whom were hanging on his every word. Richard's eyes landed on Megan, assessing her instantly. His sharp, condescending smile spread across his face. It didn't take long for him to make his move, and as he spotted her, a slow, almost predatory grin appeared. "Well, well," he muttered to his companions loud enough for nearby tables to hear, his voice oozing with mockery. "Looks like someone got lost on the way to the diner down the street." The snickers that followed were calculated, a part of Richard's cruel charm that he used to assert his dominance in spaces like these. Megan heard it, of course. But unlike the usual targets of his mockery, she didn't shrink. She didn't look down or feel embarrassed. Instead, she met his gaze with something far more unsettling. Her exhausted eyes, which had been dull moments before, now sharpened, as if she had just woken up from a long sleep, her focus shifting from tiredness to something else entirely. Megan opened her menu, her fingers stiff from the recycled air of the airplane, and as she did, she felt Richard's gaze intensify, assessing her every perceived flaw. The faint coffee stain on her sleeve. The worn-out shoes that had seen too many terminals. The absence of designer accessories, the ones that the Sterling Room's regulars wore as an unofficial badge of entry. As Megan scanned the menu, her mind was far from the choices on the page. Instead, it was on Richard, his presence looming over her like a predator circling its prey. She could feel the weight of his stare, the judgmental glances of the other diners, the quiet mockery swirling around her. But none of it fazed her. She had dealt with worse in her years of business, in rooms much colder and more calculating than this. A waiter, barely out of his 20s, approached their table. He carried the practiced smile of someone who knew the value of perfect service in the face of scrutiny. His eyes flickered nervously between Megan and Richard, as if trying to gauge the situation. "May I suggest our prefix option?" he asked, his voice soft but pointed, as if to direct Megan toward something more modest. He had already glanced at Richard's table for approval, almost asking permission to serve her. Megan's gaze remained steady, her eyes unblinking. "The full tasting menu, please," she said, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that caught the waiter off guard. "And sparkling water for now. I'll decide on wine later, after speaking with Antonio." The mention of Antonio's name seemed to strike a chord with the young waiter. His face shifted ever so slightly, a brief flicker of uncertainty passing through his eyes before he nodded, now a little less sure of himself. He turned, retreating swiftly to place her order, but not before casting one last, brief glance at Richard's table. Richard, meanwhile, hadn't been idle. His laughter sliced through the ambient hum of conversation like a knife. "Better check your credit limit first, honey," he sneered, his words loud enough to be heard by several nearby tables. "That menu costs more than your entire outfit." The laughter that followed from his companions felt rehearsed, a well-practiced act designed to make sure the entire room was in on the joke. Richard thrived on moments like these, where his public humiliation of others was not only tolerated but celebrated. It was a ritual of power, of dominance, reminding everyone that there were boundaries that should never be crossed. Boundaries of wealth, of status, and of privilege. Megan, in her simple black dress and understated presence, was far outside those boundaries, and Richard made sure the entire restaurant knew it. Megan's hand, still holding the menu, remained steady as she took a slow sip from the glass of water the waiter had just placed in front of her. She wasn't rattled by his words, and her eyes never left Richard's. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was quiet, but it carried weight. "I'm sure I'll manage." The calmness of her response seemed to fuel Richard's determination to break her. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with exaggerated disdain. This was his element, the thrill of dominance, the joy of watching others squirm under the weight of his ridicule. His eyes swept over her once more, taking in the details with a theatrical flair. "Let me guess," he began, his voice rising to ensure the entire room could hear. "Big night out? Once-in-a-lifetime splurge? Or just lost?" His questions were like darts thrown with precision, designed to wound her dignity. "Tourist bucket list, perhaps? Eat where the real New Yorkers eat?" Megan's response was measured, brief. "Just hungry." The simplicity of her answer seemed to irritate Richard more than anything else could have. She wasn't playing his game, and that frustrated him. Around them, conversations had quieted, the surrounding diners now unwilling participants in this unfolding spectacle. Some leaned in, eager to see how this would play out. Others looked away, embarrassed for her, for themselves. But Richard was relentless. "You know," he continued, his voice rising further as if daring the room to join him, "there's a perfectly decent diner 10 blocks south. Plastic menus. Free refills. Much more your ambience." He emphasized the word ambience with exaggerated care, as if teaching vocabulary to a child. His companions chuckled on cue, more than happy to indulge him. Megan didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She folded the menu slowly, her movements deliberate, calculated. Her calm response seemed to annoy Richard even more. As his companions continued to snicker, she placed her napkin neatly in her lap, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't the first person Richard had humiliated in public, but something about her unshaken composure intrigued him. He wasn't used to this kind of reaction, or rather, lack of it. The Sterling Room had always been a place where power dynamics were on full display, but this evening, the balance of that power seemed to be shifting. Richard Harrison, ever the self-appointed king of Manhattan's elite, sat back in his chair, studying Meghan with renewed interest. His companions, who had once snickered at her expense, had begun to quiet down, sensing a tension in the air that didn't belong to them. Richard, however, was unfazed. He leaned in, his voice low, carrying the same air of superiority he had worn for years. "Do you know what you're doing here?" he asked, his words dripping with condescension. "This is the Sterling Room, not some fast food joint. We don't just let anyone in, you know." He let out a short laugh, testing her reactions. Meghan didn't respond right away. She had already learned to pick her battles carefully. But this was different. Richard wasn't just poking fun at her appearance, he was undermining everything she had worked for. His mocking tone was the kind she had heard many times in different forms throughout her life. People like him thrived on making others feel small, irrelevant. But in that moment, Meghan wasn't about to play his game. She set her menu down and looked him straight in the eye. "You've made your point," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But I'm here for business, not your approval." Richard was momentarily taken aback. The slight shift in her posture, the calm authority in her voice, it wasn't the reaction he had expected. For a brief second, the smirk faltered on his face, replaced by a flicker of confusion. But it was fleeting, and his ego quickly recovered. "Oh, I'm sorry," Richard said with exaggerated sincerity. "I didn't realize we had royalty in the house." He glanced around at his companions, as if to invite them to join in on the mockery. "Should we all bow down now?" Meghan's gaze remained unbroken. She wasn't afraid of him, not of his money, not of his position. What he didn't know was that the game he was playing was one she had mastered long ago. She had survived much worse than petty men like Richard Harrison. His attempts at humiliation didn't sting as they might have for others. Instead, they only made her more resolute. Just then, the waiter returned with her sparkling water, his movements slightly more hurried than before. He placed the glass in front of her, not meeting her eyes as he quickly retreated. Meghan picked up her glass, taking a slow sip. She could feel Richard's gaze still on her, probing, searching for any sign of weakness. Richard's grin returned, this time sharper, more predatory. His eyes locked onto Meghan's, as if daring her to break under the weight of his next words. The tension between them was palpable, but Meghan held her ground, her posture relaxed but unyielding. "Tell me," Richard continued, his voice dropping lower, "how does it feel to be out of your element? To walk into a place like this, where the rules are set long before you even step through the door?" His words were laced with scorn, designed to make her question her place in this world. Meghan, still calm, set her water glass back down. "It feels fine," she replied with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm not here for the rules, Richard. I'm here for the deal." His eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of the word deal. A quiet realization began to dawn on him, one he wasn't quite prepared to acknowledge. Who was this woman? In the space of mere minutes, she had shifted from an easy target to someone who wasn't bending to his will. This was unfamiliar terrain for Richard, who had always been in control of every room he walked into. Just as he was about to unleash another round of mockery, the door to the restaurant swung open, and a tall, distinguished figure stepped inside. The subtle shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Antonio Carmine, the owner of the Sterling Room, walked in with the calm, measured grace of someone who was used to being in charge. His presence was magnetic, quiet, powerful, and commanding. Heads turned as he made his way to the front, but it was clear that no one in the room dared to speak without his permission. Meghan's face softened slightly at the sight of him, a flicker of warmth crossing her tired features. She knew Antonio well, They had been friends for years, connected not just by business but by mutual respect. Antonio's ability to read the room was unmatched, and Megan was sure that, no matter what Richard said next, the situation was about to change. Richard, however, had not yet noticed Antonio. He was still too focused on the woman before him, unable to shake the feeling that she was playing him in a way he had never been played before. The game, he realized, had shifted in ways he hadn't expected. The waiter, noticing Antonio's arrival, seemed to hesitate. He looked from Antonio to Megan, unsure how to proceed, but it was Antonio who broke the silence. "Ah, Megan," Antonio said, his voice warm and welcoming, his eyes immediately finding hers. "I wasn't expecting you so soon. I hope your flight wasn't too grueling." Megan stood to greet him, offering a tired but genuine smile. "It was a long trip, but worth it," she said, her voice carrying an ease that seemed to wash away the tension in the air. "I wanted to speak to you about the project before I head to the hotel." Antonio nodded, then turned his gaze to Richard, finally noticing him sitting at the center of the table, still smirking. His expression shifted ever so slightly, the warmth in his eyes now replaced with a quiet, calculated sharpness. "Richard," Antonio said, his voice smooth yet carrying an unspoken weight. "I see you're enjoying the evening." Richard, caught off guard by Antonio's approach, straightened in his chair. He had heard of Antonio, of course, but had never crossed paths with him before. Something about the way Antonio spoke, the way he commanded respect without raising his voice, made Richard realize he wasn't dealing with just any restaurant owner. This man was someone who held influence, a lot of it. Megan's eyes shifted between the two men, the dynamic in the room already beginning to change. Antonio's presence alone had begun to deflate the tension Richard had been feeding on for the past several minutes. Megan was no longer alone in this fight. The air in the Sterling room seemed to shift as Antonio made his way over to Richard's table. The moment he spoke, the tension that had been building between Megan and Richard began to dissolve, though Richard didn't seem to notice. He was still caught in the web of his own superiority, certain that his mocking would eventually break Megan down. Megan, however, felt a flicker of something different. Antonio's presence had a way of calming the storm, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. She'd known Antonio for years, and though his power and influence were undeniable, it was his integrity, his unwavering loyalty to those he cared about, that had always made him someone she trusted. As Antonio approached, Richard finally took note of him. He looked up, sizing him up with a quick glance before offering a dismissive nod. He had met many people in this city, but there was something about Antonio that seemed different, though he couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way Antonio moved, calm, confident, with an air of authority that was undeniable. "Antonio," Richard said with a strained smile. "I didn't realize you were in tonight." He gestured at his companions with a slight shrug, as if to say he didn't really care either way. Antonio's eyes flickered briefly to Richard's companions, then back to him. There was no smile in Antonio's expression, just a quiet, controlled intensity that Richard wasn't accustomed to. He had dealt with wealthy, powerful men before, but this man seemed to operate on an entirely different level. "I'm here to meet an old friend," Antonio replied smoothly, his voice even. "But I see you're busy with other matters." Richard's eyebrows twitched ever so slightly, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't about to let anyone, especially Antonio Carmine, distract him from his mission. He had the upper hand, and he intended to keep it. Megan watched the exchange with quiet interest. She had dealt with men like Richard before, and she knew how their minds worked. They thrived on control, on making others feel small. But she was no longer interested in playing the role of victim. The tension had shifted now, but it hadn't gone away. Megan felt it simmering beneath the surface, the quiet threat of what might come next. Antonio had always been one to step in when things got out of hand, but she wondered how far he would go for her tonight. Antonio's gaze lingered on Richard for a moment longer, measuring him, as if seeing right through the carefully constructed facade. Richard, despite his bravado, squirmed under the weight of the unspoken words. Antonio wasn't just any restaurant owner, he was a man whose reputation was built on respect, not the kind of cheap power Richard liked to flaunt. For a split second, Richard wondered if he had miscalculated. Megan, sensing the change in the atmosphere, took a deep breath and leaned back slightly in her chair. The earlier discomfort had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. It wasn't just the luxury of Antonio's presence that steadied her, it was the realization that she didn't need Richard's approval to be valuable. That knowledge settled into her bones like a quiet affirmation. Antonio took a seat across from her, his calm demeanor offering a sharp contrast to Richard's unease. He smiled warmly at Megan, as if the world outside the restaurant had momentarily ceased to exist. "I'm glad you made it," Antonio said to her, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable authority. "We have a lot to discuss. I'm sure your flight was exhausting." Megan returned his smile, though the corners of her mouth barely lifted. "It was long, but I'm used to it." She shifted her focus back to Richard, whose smirk was now replaced with a thinly veiled tension. She could tell he was already trying to recalibrate, no longer sure of his position in the room. Richard's eyes darted between Antonio and Megan. He was still processing the unexpected shift in power. He had been on the verge of breaking Megan down, of reducing her to the kind of embarrassed, overwhelmed mess that he loved to exploit. But now, he found himself facing a situation he hadn't prepared for, someone who wouldn't back down. Trying to regain control, Richard leaned forward, his voice laced with a faux politeness that barely masked his irritation. "I didn't realize you were such good friends, Antonio. I must say, I find it curious." His words, though smooth, had an edge. He was trying to sow seeds of doubt, hoping to unsettle the ground that Antonio and Megan had so carefully cultivated over the years. Antonio, however, wasn't shaken. He simply met Richard's gaze, unwavering. "Megan's a valued partner, Richard," Antonio said coolly, his voice steady. "I think you'll find that the people in this room don't quite appreciate your methods." There was no challenge in Antonio's tone, but it carried an undeniable weight. The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the room fell silent, as though everyone were waiting for Richard's next move. But Richard had no response. For the first time, he found himself without the upper hand. Megan felt the shift, felt it like a ripple through the air. It wasn't the kind of power that came from wealth or status. It was something quieter, something much harder to come by. It was the kind of power that commanded respect without the need for theatrics. And in that moment, she realized that her earlier discomfort had been misplaced. She wasn't the one out of place here. Richard was. The atmosphere in the Sterling room had shifted dramatically in the past few minutes. What had started as a tense and almost unbearable spectacle was now tempered with an unexpected calm. Richard Harrison, the man who once believed he could dominate any room with a look or a word, found himself standing on the precipice of an unfamiliar and uncomfortable territory. Antonio Carmine's presence alone had thrown off his rhythm, and now it seemed his words, once so powerful, had begun to lose their sting. Megan, on the other hand, could feel the energy change, though she kept her exterior composed. The power that had once seemed to radiate from Richard was beginning to dissipate. But it wasn't just Antonio's quiet authority that had caused this shift, it was something deeper, something in the way Megan carried herself now. No longer on the defensive, she was beginning to see Richard as more of a pawn than a player. The calmness of her demeanor was no longer about avoiding conflict, it was about recognizing her own power, a power that had always been there but had been buried beneath layers of exhaustion and self-doubt. As the moments stretched, Richard struggled to regain his footing. His usual quick retorts felt hollow now, no longer the sharp arrows they once were. Megan's unflappable composure was like a mirror reflecting back his own insecurity. Richard wasn't used to being challenged in this way. The more he tried to reassert his dominance, the more it became apparent that he wasn't in control. Finally, unable to stand the silence, Richard cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. He looked directly at Antonio, his attempt at casualness coming off more like forced bravado. "I must admit, Antonio," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, his voice tinged with a strained politeness, "I didn't expect this kind of surprise guest tonight." His eyes flicked to Megan, a flicker of annoyance still lingering. "I've heard your name tossed around in circles, but I didn't realize you had connections here." Megan didn't flinch. She knew the implication behind his words, the veiled question of how someone so unassuming could have the ear of someone like Antonio. But rather than responding to him, she turned her attention to Antonio, allowing him to take the lead. She wasn't the one who needed to justify anything to Richard. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. Antonio, ever the picture of composure, looked at Richard with something akin to amusement in his eyes. "Megan has been a part of my life for longer than I care to explain," Antonio said, his voice steady, his gaze never wavering from Richard. "And she's earned every ounce of respect she receives, far more than you could ever hope for." The silence that followed was deafening, hanging in the air like a fragile thread. The other diners, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, could feel the weight of Antonio's words. They were unspoken rules in these circles, rules about who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. And for the first time that evening, Richard felt the sting of those rules. Richard shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The words from Antonio stung more than he wanted to admit. For all his wealth and influence, he had never been called out so plainly in front of an audience. And yet, there was a part of him that could not help but acknowledge the truth in Antonio's words. Megan wasn't just a simple, overlooked woman, she was someone who commanded respect, and now Richard could see it. He forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "Respect, huh?" He paused, looking around at the other diners as if to gauge their reactions. "Well, I suppose if it's respect you're after, we should all just sit back and applaud. I'm sure we'd all love to see the underdog rise to the top." The sarcasm in his tone was unmistakable, but the smile that accompanied it was forced. The room seemed to hold its breath as he waited for a response. Megan could see the crack in Richard's armor now, his carefully constructed facade beginning to fracture. She had no intention of indulging him in his petty game of one-upmanship, but it was becoming increasingly clear that Richard wasn't going to back down without making one last attempt to regain control. Megan glanced at Antonio, then met Richard's gaze once more. Her voice was calm but unwavering. "I don't need applause, Richard. And I'm certainly not here to play a game of who's more important." Her words cut through the air like a knife, their precision leaving no room for doubt. "I'm here because I've earned my place at the table, and I've done it by hard work and integrity." Richard blinked, the implication of her words settling over him like a heavy weight. Megan wasn't some naive woman stumbling into his world by accident. She wasn't just there to fill a space, she had earned her place, and in a way that terrified him. His world, where power was wielded with arrogance and casual cruelty, had no room for someone like her. She was an anomaly. And that, more than anything, made him feel small. The weight of the moment stretched on, Richard's confidence faltering further with each passing second. Around them, the restaurant's atmosphere seemed to shift. Some diners exchanged glances, their previously entertained expressions now replaced by an air of discomfort. Others tried to carry on with their meals, but there was no denying the subtle change in the room's energy. Antonio, sensing that Richard was about to crumble under the pressure, decided to take the reins once more. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Richard's. "I think we're done here, Richard," Antonio said, his tone low but firm. "I've got more important matters to attend to." His words were final, but there was no malice in them, only a quiet certainty. He was dismissing Richard, not with the indignity of a public outburst, but with the quiet authority that Richard could never hope to match. For a moment, Richard said nothing, just sat there, his face a mix of frustration and confusion. He wasn't used to being dismissed, not like this. But as the seconds ticked by, he realized there was nothing more he could say. He was out of his depth. Antonio stood, and Megan followed suit, her movements graceful and deliberate. She cast one last glance at Richard, but her gaze was no longer one of confrontation, it was simply a look that acknowledged his defeat. The two of them left the table, the eyes of the restaurant still following them, but this time, there was no laughter, no whispers. Only silence, as Richard Harrison sat alone, his carefully built world slowly crumbling around him. As Megan and Antonio exited the restaurant, the weight of the moment seemed to linger in the air long after they had left Richard and his companions behind. The cool evening breeze hit Megan's face as they walked down the steps, and for the first time that evening, she felt a release, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Antonio, sensing the shift in her, offered a small, reassuring smile. "Are you all right?" Antonio asked, his tone warm but knowing. He had seen Megan face far greater challenges than this, but he understood that moments like these could still leave a mark. Megan nodded, though her mind was still swirling. "I'm fine. Just, not used to having to stand my ground like that." Her voice was soft, but there was an underlying strength to it. She wasn't just referring to Richard. This was about everything, her entire life, the expectations, the sacrifices, and now the acknowledgement of her worth. Antonio slowed his pace, letting Megan take the lead for a moment. He had always respected her space, but he also understood the weight she carried. She had been in this world long before she met him, working through the challenges with a quiet tenacity that often went unnoticed by those around her. But Antonio had always known who she truly was, and tonight, he saw a side of her that had been hidden, a side that was ready to stand up, not just for herself, but for everything she believed in. "You handled it well," Antonio added after a beat, glancing at her with a hint of pride. "Richard is used to people cowering when he makes a mockery of them. He won't know what hit him." Megan managed a small smile at that. She wasn't concerned about Richard's response, what troubled her was the realization that the game had changed. The room had shifted, and she was no longer just the quiet observer. The respect she had long ago earned in her field, the respect that wasn't dependent on appearances, was now beginning to translate into her personal life. They reached Antonio's car, and he opened the door for her. Megan slid inside, settling into the soft leather seat, her thoughts still lingering on the confrontation they had just left behind. She knew it wasn't over. Richard would retaliate in his own way, he always did. But for now, she was in control of her narrative. "I didn't expect it to feel so different." Antonio slid into the driver's seat, his eyes on the road ahead. "What do you mean?" "I've spent so much of my life making sure I didn't disrupt the status quo. Keeping my head down, blending in. Tonight, I couldn't do that." And it felt liberating. There was a long pause as Antonio processed her words. "You've always been in control, Megan. Maybe tonight, you're just realizing it for yourself." Megan let out a quiet sigh, her gaze drifting out the window as the city lights flickered past. Antonio's words lingered in her mind, like a slow-burning realization she had been too busy to notice. She had always believed that her worth was something that had to be earned in the shadows, a quiet force in the background. But tonight had shown her that standing her ground was its own kind of strength, a strength that didn't need to be hidden anymore. As they drove through the streets of Manhattan, the energy from the restaurant still seemed to hang in the air, but now it felt different. It wasn't oppressive anymore, it was empowering. Megan glanced at Antonio, who was navigating the streets with his usual calm precision, his hands steady on the wheel. She wondered what he was thinking, but didn't ask. She wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Instead, she focused on the feeling in her chest, the one that had started as a small flicker but was now beginning to burn brighter. She wasn't sure what would come next. What she did know was that Richard Harrison's laughter had lost its bite. And no matter what happened, she wasn't going to let it control her anymore. Antonio broke the silence, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "You know, Richard will likely try to spin this. He'll try to make it look like you're the one who's in the wrong, that you're out of your depth." Megan didn't respond immediately, but she could feel the weight of his words sinking in. She had no doubt that Richard would try to reclaim the narrative. That was his game, after all, spinning his words until they became the truth, making people doubt themselves. Let him, Megan said after a beat, her voice firmer now. Let him try. I don't need him to validate me. Antonio gave a knowing smile, the kind that spoke volumes about their long-standing friendship. I don't think you ever needed him to validate you. But you've just made it clear to everyone else that you don't need anyone's permission to be yourself. Megan nodded, her heart beating a little faster now, the exhilaration of the night finally starting to take hold. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of what Richard could say or do. I suppose the next step is figuring out how to make this all work. I'm not just here for a night in the spotlight. I came for something more. Antonio's expression softened, his gaze flicking to her for just a moment before returning to the road. You've always been about the long game, Megan. I have no doubt you'll figure it out. Whatever it is. The words hung in the air between them, as much a statement of truth as a quiet promise. Megan knew she had a purpose here, something bigger than this moment of confrontation. But the events of the evening had shifted something in her. A realization had settled in her chest, and it was the kind that changed everything. As they turned onto the familiar streets leading to Antonio's home, the noise of the city began to fade, replaced by the soft hum of the car's engine and the quiet between them. Megan couldn't help but wonder what the future held, what her next move would be. She had entered Richard's world tonight, and she had left with her head held high. But there was still more to this story. The days following the encounter at the Sterling Room had passed in a blur for Megan. She found herself caught between the satisfaction of having stood her ground and the quiet uncertainty of what came next. Richard's humiliation still lingered in the back of her mind, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that his defeat had little to do with her. It wasn't just his public exposure or Antonio's intervention that had shifted the room, it was the way she had owned the moment. She hadn't just resisted, she had changed the course of the evening with a simple, steady confidence that felt both liberating and unsettling. Megan sat in her apartment that evening, looking out at the skyline, her mind racing with the possibilities. The city was still buzzing below her, a cacophony of lives, dreams, and ambitions. She, too, was caught up in that whirlwind. And yet, despite everything that had happened, there was a part of her that felt uncertain about what she truly wanted next. What was she meant to do with this newfound power? Was this just a fluke, a momentary disruption in the status quo, or was there a purpose behind it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a message on her phone. It was from Antonio. We need to talk. It's time for the next step. Meet me tomorrow at the office. I've got some things to discuss. Megan read the message twice before placing her phone down. She trusted Antonio, had trusted him for years, but something about his words felt different this time. There was an urgency to them, a quiet weight that suggested more than just the next chapter in their ongoing projects. Antonio had always been a man of few words, but when he chose them carefully, they carried the weight of entire worlds. She couldn't ignore the feeling that this was more than just a conversation about work. Whatever Antonio had to say, it was likely to change things in a way she couldn't yet predict. The following morning, Megan dressed carefully. She chose a simple, but sophisticated, navy dress and paired it with understated jewelry, her usual style, not drawing attention but commanding respect. She had a meeting with Antonio, yes, but there was something else at play today. She could feel the undercurrent of change in the air, like the quiet stillness before a storm. As she entered the sleek office building where Antonio's firm was headquartered, she was greeted by familiar faces, faces she'd known for years, each of them contributing to the empire Antonio had built. She made her way through the minimalist, glass-walled corridors, feeling the quiet hum of industry around her. The walls were adorned with tasteful art, and the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Everything here was meticulously curated, as if nothing was left to chance. Megan knew this place well. It was where business was made, where connections were solidified, and where decisions were carved out of thin air. Megan walked through the office, her steps echoing slightly in the quiet hallway. The usual hum of productivity was more palpable today, as if everyone knew something significant was about to happen. The atmosphere, usually calm, now seemed charged with anticipation. She reached Antonio's office and knocked lightly before entering. Antonio was sitting at his desk, looking over a set of documents, but when he saw Megan, he immediately stood up and gestured for her to sit. There was a calm assurance in his movements, but the lines of his face seemed more tense than usual. Something was different today, and Megan could feel it. "Megan, thanks for coming," Antonio said, his voice steady, but there was an undercurrent of something, concern, perhaps, or the weight of an unspoken truth. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." Megan took a seat, her gaze steady on Antonio. She knew better than to rush him. Antonio never said more than necessary, but when he did speak, it was always measured, always deliberate. "You've done well," Antonio began, his eyes meeting hers. "Better than I expected. You handled yourself at the Sterling Room like a pro. But there's something more you need to understand." Megan raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Antonio leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he stared at her, considering his next words carefully. What happened with Richard wasn't just a public embarrassment for him. It was a wake-up call. For you, for me, for everyone who's been watching you. You've been playing small for too long, Megan. Hiding behind the work. But it's time to step into a bigger role. Megan felt a tightness in her chest. She wasn't sure what Antonio was getting at, but his words were cutting through her like a sharp knife. She had always been cautious, preferring to avoid the spotlight, staying focused on the business side of things, not the drama. But something was shifting, and she could feel it. "I've never been someone who seeks attention, Antonio," she said quietly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "I've worked hard, and I've built a reputation, but I'm not sure I'm ready to take that step." Antonio's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice more urgent now. "Megan, you're not being given a choice anymore. You've already taken that step. You just don't realize it yet. Richard's little performance wasn't just a fluke, it was a clear sign that you're no longer just a background player. You're part of something bigger now. And it's time for you to decide if you want to take control of that or let it slip away." His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring her to acknowledge what had already shifted. Megan's mind raced. She wasn't someone who shied away from challenges, but this? This was different. She had been comfortable in the background, letting her work speak for itself. But now, Antonio was telling her that it was time to step forward, to become the face of something more than just the deals she brokered and the quiet influence she had accumulated over the years. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She wasn't sure what to say, not yet. Antonio seemed to sense her hesitation, and he sat back in his chair, his posture still calm but resolute. "Take your time, Megan. But know this, whatever you decide, I'll be here. You've earned your place in this world, but how far you go from here is entirely up to you." The weight of his words settled on her, and for the first time in a long while, Megan felt the full scope of the opportunity and the responsibility that lay ahead. The following days were filled with a whirlwind of decisions. Megan had taken Antonio's words to heart, and though she hadn't fully processed the weight of the responsibility he had placed on her, she felt something stirring inside, an undeniable pull to something greater. She had always known her work was important, but now, as Antonio had pointed out, it was time for her to step into the light. The quiet influence she had once wielded from behind the scenes was no longer enough. The world was waiting for her to take a bolder stance, and the question that loomed in her mind was no longer if she could do it, but how. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Antonio. "I've scheduled a meeting for tomorrow. It's time to discuss your next steps." Megan stared at the message for a moment before setting her phone down. Tomorrow. It felt like a lifetime away, but at the same time, it was right around the corner. She had no doubt that Antonio had big plans for her, but what those plans were, she wasn't entirely sure. She had learned to trust him over the years, but this was different. This wasn't just another deal or business opportunity. This was about her future, her role in a much bigger picture, and that was a lot to take in. The next day, Megan found herself back in Antonio's office. As always, the minimalist space was perfectly curated, the sunlight filtering through the glass walls, casting a warm glow on the modern furniture. Antonio was sitting behind his desk when she arrived, his posture relaxed but with the same sharp focus she had always admired. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been thinking a lot about the direction we need to go," Antonio said, his tone serious. "You've shown that you're ready for more, Megan. But stepping into a new role comes with risks. There will be those who won't like the change. And there will be those who will test you." Megan stood across from his desk, her posture straight, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the uncertainty she still felt. "I understand the risks. I'm ready." The words came out more confidently than she felt, but she wasn't about to show any hesitation. Not now. Antonio's gaze softened for a moment, as if he could sense the inner turmoil that Megan was working hard to keep hidden. He nodded slowly. "Good. Because what's coming next is going to change everything." Antonio leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him as he looked at Megan with a mix of approval and calculated intent. There was a weight to the silence between them, a shared understanding that this was the moment that would define the future. The Sterling Room incident was more than just a confrontation, Antonio continued, his voice steady but firm. It was a signal. People saw it, your strength, your resolve. You made a choice in that moment to stand tall, and now everyone is watching. His words were not meant to intimidate, but to acknowledge the shift that had already begun. Megan stood still, absorbing what he was saying. She had always been good at reading people, and she knew that Antonio wasn't just talking about the incident at the restaurant. This was about something bigger, something that went beyond the walls of the Sterling Room. This was about how she would be perceived, not just by the people in the room, but by those who could shape her destiny. "So, what do you suggest?" Megan asked, her voice calmer than she felt. She wasn't sure where this conversation was leading, but she trusted Antonio. She had to. Antonio's lips twitched in a slight smile. "I want you to step into the leadership role at the firm. I'm not talking about managing a few deals or handling the international projects. I mean a real leadership position. You will be the face of our next big expansion, the person who drives this company into new territory." Megan's breath caught in her throat. She had always been behind the scenes, working tirelessly, but never standing at the front. To be the face of a company, to lead the way, this was a level she had never dared to dream of. "That's a big leap," Megan said softly, almost to herself. She was grappling with the enormity of it all. Was she truly ready for this? Was she ready to be the one others looked to for answers? Antonio nodded, his expression serious. "It is. But you've proven time and again that you're capable of more than you think. This is your chance to show the world just how far you can go. To stop hiding behind your work and take the reins." The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around her. Megan's heart raced as she considered what was at stake. She had worked for years to get to this point, but now she had to ask herself the hardest question: was she ready to change everything? There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if I say yes, what happens next?" Antonio's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "Then we begin. I'll support you, but this has to come from you. The decisions you make from here on out will shape everything. You'll have the power to build something new, something that reflects the strength and vision you've always had." Megan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his words sink in. The idea of stepping into this new role was terrifying, but it also lit a fire inside her. For the first time, she realized that it wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about building something lasting, something with meaning. This wasn't just about the deals. It was about legacy. With a final, steadying breath, Megan straightened her shoulders and met Antonio's gaze. "I'm in. Let's do it." Antonio smiled, a knowing smile, one that carried the weight of approval and anticipation. "I knew you would be." As they began to discuss the details, Megan felt a sense of resolve settle over her. She had made her choice. Now, it was time to lead. The days following Megan's decision to take the leadership role felt like a blur of meetings, calls, and decisions that weighed on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the responsibility of overseeing major projects, it was the realization that her every move would now be under intense scrutiny. She had entered a world where even the smallest misstep could send ripples through everything she had worked for. Despite the chaos of the past few days, there was a certain sense of clarity that Megan had never felt before. She was no longer just part of the background machinery of the company, she was at the helm. And with that power came the necessity to navigate the waters of leadership with grace and precision. She couldn't afford to make mistakes, not now. She had spent her career carefully crafting her reputation as a strategist, someone who could read a room and move the pieces around with quiet finesse. But now, as she stood on the precipice of something much larger, Megan understood that her role had evolved. It was no longer enough to be the quiet force in the background. She needed to step into the spotlight, to become the kind of leader who inspired confidence in others, not just through her intellect but through her presence. Megan was sitting in her office, looking over the latest reports. The team had made great progress, but there were still challenges ahead. As she scanned through the numbers, her phone buzzed with a message from Antonio. "We need to talk. There's something I haven't told you yet. Meet me in an hour." Her heart skipped a beat. The tone of Antonio's message was urgent, and for the first time, Megan felt a pang of doubt. She had been so focused on the transition, on proving herself in her new role, that she hadn't stopped to ask if there were other aspects of the company, other forces, that she hadn't considered. Antonio had been supportive, yes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here than he had let on. She glanced at the clock. An hour was plenty of time to gather her thoughts and prepare for whatever news Antonio had for her. Megan took a deep breath and stood up, straightening her blouse as she walked out of her office, her mind racing with possibilities. Whatever it was, she knew it was something that would change the course of everything. Megan walked briskly through the sleek corridors of Antonio's office building, her mind still spinning from the message. She knew Antonio well enough to understand that when he said "we need to talk," it wasn't a casual conversation. The weight of his words from their last meeting hung in the back of her mind. He had warned her that stepping into her new role would come with challenges, but now, it seemed like the real test was beginning. She arrived at Antonio's office a few minutes early, her steps slowing as she reached the door. She knocked lightly, then entered without waiting for a response. Antonio was seated at his desk, looking over some documents. When he saw her, he set them aside and motioned for her to take a seat. "Megan, thank you for coming," he said, his tone professional but with a hint of something deeper, something that Megan couldn't quite place. He didn't smile, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her immediately more alert. "What's going on, Antonio?" Megan asked, her voice steady, but she couldn't hide the curiosity and the underlying tension in her words. She had always trusted Antonio, but something about the gravity in his demeanor told her this conversation was about more than just business. Antonio leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the surface of his desk. "I've been giving a lot of thought to the direction of the company, especially now that you're stepping into a larger role. But there are other factors that you need to be aware of." Megan furrowed her brow. "Other factors? What do you mean?" Antonio sighed and stood up, pacing a little before turning to face her. "It's not just about your leadership. There are people who will see your rise and want to take advantage of it. There are factions within the company, people who've been around for years, who may not be happy with the changes you represent. Megan's heart skipped a beat. She had always been aware of office politics, but this was different. Antonio wasn't just talking about minor disagreements or rivals, he was talking about real power struggles, and that changed everything. "You're saying I have enemies already?" Megan asked, her voice steady despite the unsettling realization. Antonio met her gaze, his eyes unflinching. "Not enemies, not yet. But there are people who will resist the changes you're trying to implement. They'll test you. They'll try to undermine your position. The question is whether you'll be ready to face them when they do." The weight of his words settled over her like a thick fog. This wasn't just a leadership challenge, this was a battle for control, a fight she hadn't fully anticipated. Megan had always been a strategist, but now she realized that she needed to prepare for more than just handling projects and leading teams. She had to prepare for warfare. The weeks following Antonio's warning passed quickly, each day more intense than the last. Megan had stepped into her new role with determination, managing both the challenges of overseeing the firm's expansion and the political maneuvering that had started to surface. As much as she tried to focus on the work, there was an undercurrent of tension that couldn't be ignored. She could feel the eyes on her, and it wasn't just her team looking for guidance, it was the people who had been at the company long before her, those who weren't quite sure what to make of her rise. There were whispers in the halls, quiet conversations that stopped when she walked by. At first, she'd hoped it was her imagination, but it soon became clear that there were those in the company who weren't happy about the changes she represented. Megan wasn't naive enough to think her leadership would be welcomed by all, but the quiet resistance had started to feel more like an obstacle than a challenge. One afternoon, as Megan sat in her office reviewing contracts, her assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Megan, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of hesitation. "They said it's urgent." Megan glanced at the clock. She had a meeting with the legal team in an hour, but if it was important, she couldn't afford to ignore it. "Who is it?" "A Mr. Harrison." The name hit Megan like a punch to the gut. Richard Harrison, the same man who had tried to belittle her at the Sterling Room. She hadn't thought about him in weeks, but his reappearance now sent a ripple of unease through her. What could he possibly want? "Send him in," Megan said, her voice steady. She had dealt with worse before. Richard Harrison would be no different. The door opened, and there he was, standing in the doorway with that all-too-familiar smirk on his face. Richard had always been a man who used his presence as a weapon, and even now, despite the fall from grace he'd suffered months ago, he still carried himself like he owned the room. "Megan," he said, his tone dripping with feigned warmth. "I was hoping we could talk. I believe we have some unfinished business." Megan kept her expression neutral, though she couldn't hide the faintest flicker of surprise. She hadn't expected Richard to come to her directly. She had assumed he'd fade into the background, nursing his bruised ego after his public defeat. But now, as he stood there, it was clear that Richard hadn't given up. Whatever game he was playing, she had a feeling this would be just the beginning. Richard stepped into the room with an air of calculated confidence, closing the door behind him. Megan remained seated, her gaze unwavering as he took a seat across from her. For a moment, they simply regarded one another in silence. Megan could feel the tension, thick as smoke in the air. She had no intention of allowing him to regain any kind of advantage here, but she knew better than to underestimate him. "I wasn't expecting a visit," Megan said coolly, leaning back in her chair. "What can I do for you, Mr. Harrison?" Richard flashed her that signature smile, the one that always seemed to mask something darker beneath. "I think we both know why I'm here," he said, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on the subtle luxury of the office. "You've made quite a name for yourself. Rising up through the ranks, taking over the firm, impressive, really." Megan didn't respond immediately. She had no need to. He was trying to provoke her, to bait her into reacting emotionally. But she was no longer the woman he had met at the Sterling Room, and he was about to find that out the hard way. You didn't come here to compliment me, Richard, Megan finally said, her tone sharp. So, let's get to the point. What do you want? He leaned forward slightly, his posture casual but the intensity in his eyes unmistakable. I want to make you an offer. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation that night, and let's just say I see some opportunities for us to work together. Megan's eyebrows arched in response. Work together? The word hung in the air between them, her disbelief barely concealed. She couldn't fathom what he had in mind. After everything that happened, you think I'd consider working with you? Richard's smile faded just a little, but his confidence never wavered. You're a smart woman, Megan. You understand how the game works. The truth is, the company you're running now, it's not as simple as you think. There are people behind the scenes who want to see you fail. You can't do this alone. You need allies, and I can help you make the right connections. The words hit harder than Megan had expected. She'd known that there were factions within the company, people who resisted her rise. But hearing Richard say it so directly made it real in a way she hadn't fully grasped. There were forces at play that she hadn't anticipated, forces that could derail everything she was trying to build. Richard continued, his voice smooth, his gaze never leaving hers. I've got influence. Connections you don't have yet. I can help you secure the power you need, and in exchange, I'll expect something in return. A partnership, a share of your success. Megan sat back, processing his offer. On the surface, it was tempting. He was offering power, resources, and the alliances she needed to solidify her position. But she knew Richard too well. His idea of a partnership was never about mutual benefit, it was about control. And why would I trust you? Megan asked, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. The last time we spoke, you tried to humiliate me in front of a room full of people. Why would I want to work with someone like you? Richard's eyes flickered, but his smirk returned quickly. Because, Megan, in this world, it's not about being liked. It's about power. You can pretend to play nice, but you know as well as I do that the real game is played with the people who have the leverage. I have that leverage. For the first time in their conversation, Megan allowed herself a smile. I don't need your leverage, Richard. I've built my own. Richard's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't back down. We'll see about that, won't we? He said cryptically, standing up. You'll come around. I'll be here when you're ready to take the real step forward. He turned to leave, but Megan's voice stopped him just as his hand touched the door. You're wrong about one thing, Richard, she said, her tone icy now. I don't need you or anyone else to define my success. I'll find my own way. Richard paused, but only for a moment. He didn't say anything else before walking out, the door clicking shut behind him. Megan sat in silence for a moment, her mind swirling with the implications of his visit. He had come with an offer, but more importantly, he had come with a warning. The battle for control was just beginning. The days following Richard's visit were filled with an unsettling quiet. Megan had expected the usual barrage of emails, calls, and meetings. But everything felt different now. The air was thick with the unspoken knowledge that something was shifting, and it wasn't just in the office, it was in the very fabric of the company itself. The stakes had never been higher, and as much as she tried to stay focused on the work ahead, the whisper of Richard's words lingered in her mind. She was walking a fine line. On one hand, there was the business, the projects, the expansion, the growing influence she was gaining with each decision. On the other, there were the forces within the company that were watching her every move, scrutinizing her leadership at every turn. Some of them were allies, yes, but more and more, Megan could feel the silent resistance from the people who didn't think she belonged at the helm. Richard had been right about one thing, power, at least the kind she needed to truly succeed, wasn't just handed over. It was something you had to take, and even then, it wasn't secure. That evening, Megan found herself alone in her office, sorting through a stack of reports. She hadn't planned on staying late, but the pressure of the day had left her restless. The familiar hum of the city outside her window was a reminder that, while the world moved forward, she was still here, quietly working, silently fighting for her place. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a text from Antonio. "We need to talk. The situation's changing faster than we expected. Meet me in the morning, 9 a.m. Megan's heart rate quickened. Antonio had been her closest confidant in this journey, but lately, she had sensed a distance growing between them. She knew there were still things he wasn't telling her, things that needed to be said. But whatever they were, she knew the conversation was long overdue. She stared at the message for a few moments, the weight of it pressing down on her. Was this the conversation that would finally clarify everything? Or was it just another puzzle piece in a larger game she hadn't fully understood yet? The next morning, Megan arrived at Antonio's office early. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint glow over the city's skyline, but the weight of the day already felt heavy on her shoulders. She'd spent the night turning over every possible scenario in her head. What could Antonio possibly need to discuss now? Was this the moment everything would finally come into focus, or was it the beginning of something darker? When she entered Antonio's office, he was sitting at his desk, flipping through a few files with a calm, measured demeanor. But there was a sharpness to his eyes, a glint that told her this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Good morning," Antonio greeted her, looking up from the papers with a nod, though the greeting didn't feel quite as warm as usual. He set the file down and motioned for her to take a seat. Megan sat across from him, her gaze steady but searching. "You wanted to talk?" she asked, her voice even, though her pulse quickened. Antonio exhaled deeply, as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "Things are moving faster than I anticipated. There are changes happening behind the scenes, big changes, and I need you to be prepared for what's coming." Megan felt a shiver run through her. She had suspected something was afoot, but hearing it from Antonio made it feel too real. "What kind of changes?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Antonio leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. "There are factions in the company that have started to mobilize. People who are loyal to the old way of doing things. They're not happy with how things are evolving, and they're ready to make a move. You've already made an impact, Megan, and they don't like it." Megan's mind raced. She had been prepared for resistance, but this sounded different, this sounded like a full-blown challenge. "Are they planning something?" she asked, trying to keep her tone steady, though she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Antonio's eyes darkened. "Yes. They've been meeting in private, talking about undermining your authority, getting the board to question your decisions. They're not going to stop until they've regained control. This isn't just a matter of office politics anymore, it's a power struggle." The weight of his words hit Megan with full force. She had known there were whispers, but she hadn't realized how organized the opposition was. There were people who weren't just resisting change, they were actively working against her. Megan's mind raced as she sat across from Antonio in his office. The weight of his words, the factions, the subtle undermining, the threats against her position, had been enough to send a ripple of panic through her. But panic wasn't something she could afford. She had spent too many years in this business, too many hours in the shadows, to let something like this throw her off course. "So, what do we do now?" Megan asked, her voice calm, but her eyes were sharp, betraying the urgency that churned within her. Antonio had just laid out the reality of the situation, but now the question was how they would respond. Antonio didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as if deep in thought. He was always the picture of composure, and Megan admired that about him. But today, even he seemed to be grappling with something more. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but laced with something more serious than usual. "We need to act quickly. If we allow them to gather too much strength, it could be too late to recover. They're already sowing doubt with the board, questioning your leadership, your decisions. It's time to make a move that will put an end to this once and for all." Megan felt her heart rate pick up. What do you mean? What kind of move? She wasn't used to acting out of haste, but the situation was changing rapidly, and she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. Antonio stood up and walked over to the large window overlooking the city. The early morning light cast a soft glow across his face, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. We need to make a statement. A decisive move that shows the company, and everyone else, that you're in control. We need to go to the board, make it clear that the future of this company is yours, and that anyone who stands in the way will be dealt with. Megan felt a surge of energy as she absorbed his words. She had never been one to make grand gestures, preferring to work behind the scenes, pulling the strings quietly. But Antonio was right. The time for subtlety had passed. If she wanted to survive this power struggle, she had to take a stand. And you think the board will back me? Megan asked, her voice slightly doubtful. She knew how entrenched the old guard was in the company, and their loyalty wasn't something she could take for granted. Antonio turned to face her, his expression unwavering. I believe they will, but only if you show them that you can lead. This isn't about being liked, Megan. It's about showing them that you have the strength to carry this company forward, that you won't back down in the face of pressure. Once they see that, they'll have no choice but to fall in line. Megan stood up from her chair, her thoughts racing. Antonio's words had sparked something in her, a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface. For years, she had quietly worked, strategically positioning herself in the background, gaining influence without seeking the limelight. But now, it was time to claim her place at the forefront. The stakes were higher than ever, and the world was watching. She took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling over her. You're right, she said, her voice more resolute than it had been before. It's time to act. But I want to do this on my terms. I won't make this about just power. I want them to see what I can bring to the table, not just what I can take from it. Antonio nodded, his expression thoughtful but approving. That's the approach I was hoping for. But remember, this isn't about playing nice. You'll need to show them that you can make the hard decisions, the ones that ensure the future of this company. Megan's mind shifted as she thought about the board, the people she would have to face. They were powerful, entrenched in their positions, and many of them had been around far longer than she had. But that didn't matter now. They would have to acknowledge her strength, her vision, because it was the only way forward. She would take control, not just of the company, but of her own future. So, what's the plan? She asked, ready to move. Antonio walked back to his desk and pulled out a folder from a drawer. He handed it to her, and she opened it to reveal a detailed plan, one that laid out the steps she would need to take to solidify her position. The strategy was clear: she would need to meet with the board, one by one, to gain their trust and support. But more importantly, she would have to show them that the path she was proposing was the only one that would lead to the company's growth and future success. There was no room for compromise. You'll need to move quickly, Antonio said, his voice firm. Once they realize you're not backing down, they'll either support you or fall in line. But you have to be decisive. There's no room for hesitation. Megan closed the folder, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced before. The plan was solid, and with Antonio's guidance, she was ready to face the challenge head-on. She paused for a moment, her gaze meeting his. This is it. No more playing small. It's time to take control. Antonio gave a small smile, the kind that conveyed both pride and the weight of the situation. Exactly. This is your moment, Megan. Own it. As she left Antonio's office, a quiet determination filled her. The next few weeks would be crucial. She would have to fight for her place, but this time, she wouldn't be doing it in the shadows. This time, Megan was ready to take the reins. Megan sat at the head of the long conference table, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze steady. The board members were gathered around her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, each one silently weighing her every word, every move. The tension in the room was palpable, but Megan didn't flinch. This was her moment. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for. She had been preparing for this meeting for weeks, researching the company's financials, understanding every angle of the business, and formulating a plan that would secure the future of the firm. But more than that, she had been preparing herself. She had made the decision that no matter what, she would face this challenge head-on. She had spent years in the shadows, quietly navigating the politics of the company, but now, it was time to step into the light and show them what she was capable of. Antonio had been right. She couldn't afford to hesitate. She had to act decisively, without fear or second-guessing. The room fell silent as she began. Thank you all for being here today. I know some of you have had concerns about the direction of the company and the changes we've been implementing. But I'm here to make one thing clear, the path we're on is the right one. And I'm here to lead us forward. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it now, a confidence that had been hard-earned. Megan could see the subtle shift in the room as her words sank in. She was no longer just the new hire, the outsider trying to fit in. She was the leader. And she was about to prove it. Our industry is changing, she continued, her eyes scanning the faces around the table. And we can either change with it, or we can stay where we are, stagnant, and risk losing everything. The decision is ours. She paused, allowing her words to settle. She could feel the weight of the moment. There was no going back now. We need to invest in new technology, new markets. We need to expand our reach beyond what we've done before. And most importantly, we need to embrace change, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. I have the vision, the plan, and the commitment to see this through. But I need your support. There was a murmur among the board members, a low hum of conversation that signaled their deliberation. Megan's heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had worked too hard for this. She wasn't going to back down now. She could feel the pressure mounting, but she also felt something else. A sense of peace. She had made the right decision. She had stepped into the role she was meant to play, and now it was time to take control. The murmur of conversation faded as the board members processed her words. Megan could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the skepticism beginning to give way to curiosity. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was enough. She knew she was reaching them, not just with her ideas, but with her unwavering presence. She wasn't asking for approval anymore, she was commanding it. She stood up, pacing slowly in front of the table, her movements purposeful. We've been at a crossroads for too long, she continued, her voice now carrying a strength that resonated in the room. For years, we've operated with the same mindset, the same old tactics. But the world is changing faster than we can keep up. If we want to stay competitive, we need to innovate, diversify, and push ourselves into new territories. She could feel Richard's gaze from the far end of the table. His presence was still strong despite everything that had happened between them. But now, there was a new understanding between them, unspoken but clear. He had underestimated her once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. I'm not here to maintain the status quo, Megan said, her gaze shifting to each board member in turn. I'm here to lead this company into the future. And I'm asking for your trust, your faith in the vision I'm offering. We will move forward with confidence, and we will do it together. There was a long silence after she finished speaking. Megan stood there, waiting, feeling the weight of the moment. The board members exchanged glances, each one processing what she had said. Megan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, resistance, and obstacles to overcome. But she was ready for them. This wasn't just about securing a vote, this was about solidifying her place, showing the world that she was the one in control now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the senior board members, a longtime ally of the old guard, spoke up. You've got guts, Megan, he said, his tone more respectful than it had been when they first met. "You're right. The industry is changing. And maybe it's time we did too. I'll back you." Megan's heart skipped a beat. That was the first vote of confidence she'd needed, and it felt like the first domino had finally fallen. Slowly, one by one, the rest of the board members spoke up, offering their support, some more hesitantly than others, but all agreeing that Megan's vision was the right one for the company. By the end of the meeting, Megan had secured the support she needed. The future of the company, at least for now, was in her hands. As the board members filed out of the room, Antonio stayed behind, watching her with quiet pride. "You did it," he said simply, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Megan felt a rush of emotions: relief, triumph, exhaustion, but most of all, an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. She had fought for this, not just for the company, but for herself. She had shown them that she wasn't just a survivor in this industry, she was a force to be reckoned with. "It's just the beginning," Megan replied, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on the future. "There's still a long road ahead." Antonio nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know. But you've got this." Megan walked out of the conference room, the weight of the decision still hanging on her shoulders, but now, it felt lighter. She had taken control, and now, the world was waiting for her next move. And for the first time, Megan was ready to make it.